Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really fundamental when it comes to studying people, ethics.
That's right.
We've gathered some fascinating material that digs into how our ideas of right and wrong shape the whole process, how we research human behavior, what we find, and then, crucially, how that knowledge gets used.
Exactly. It's about getting you up to speed on these vital ethical considerations.
Yeah, because when you study people's psychology, sociology, economics, you run into unique challenges, don't you?
You absolutely do. Our sources today really spotlight the responsibilities, the potential problems, and some pretty important lessons we've learned both from the past and from things happening right now.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking how these ethical guidelines actually shape the methods researchers use. It's not just like an afterthought, is it?
No, not at all. It's integral. Modern research ethics, especially with institutional review boards, IRBs, those committees reviewing proposals, they really came into their own after some, well, concerning studies.
Like Milgram.
Milgram is the classic example, yeah. You had participants experiencing genuine distress, thinking they were giving painful electric shocks to someone else as part of a study.
Wow.
And the public reaction, it really drove home the need for much stricter oversight. So now, any kind of deception in research faces really strict criteria.
Right, there has to be minimal risk.
Minimal risk, exactly. And a comprehensive debriefing telling people what really happened afterwards, that's mandatory. The core idea is, participant well-being comes first, always.
You can't just mislead people if it might cause harm. Simple as that, really.
Oh, yeah.
But it gets tricky even online, doesn't it? That 2014 Facebook emotional-contagion study is a good example here.
Oh, definitely. They tweaked the news feeds for, what was it, almost 700,000 users to see if seeing more positive or negative posts affected their own posts.
And people didn't know they were part of it.
That was the crux of it. Users were completely unaware, no choice to opt out. And even though it might seem like a small change to your feed, it sparked this huge ethical debate. It really pushed IRBs to create new rules for this kind of large-scale A/B testing online. It brought up all these questions about informed consent in digital spaces, like what's public versus private online. It's still evolving.
So even scrolling your social media, you might be part of research. And there are ethics around that too, huh? But it's not just about stopping bad things, right? Ethics can actually help make research better.
Yes, exactly. Our sources highlight this too. Take the UK Behavioral Insights team, the Nudge Unit.
All right.
They ran this trial on tax compliance. They just added a simple sentence to reminder letters saying most people in your area paid on time.
A social norm nudge.
Precisely. It wasn't coercive. People could opt out of future messages, totally respected their autonomy. And the result?
It worked.
Yeah, our sources say compliance went up by 5 to 15 percentage points. Significant. It shows that ethical constraints don't have to get in the way of effective, usable research. They can actually lead to better outcomes.
That's a really crucial point. Ethical can be effective. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Our sources then talk about the different ethical duties when studying humans versus animals. It's not the same landscape, is it?
No, it's quite different. With humans, the absolute cornerstone is autonomy. Informed consent is paramount. Participants have to understand the risks, the benefits, and know they can walk away anytime, no penalty.
Right. You have to respect their choice.
Absolutely. Animals, obviously, can't give informed consent. So the ethical framework there is built around the 3 Rs.
Replacement, reduction, refinement.
That's it. Replacement, use alternatives if possible. Reduction, use the fewest animals necessary. And refinement, minimize any potential pain or distress.
And it seems like these areas are maybe converging slightly, or at least influencing each other.
That's a really interesting point. There's definitely a trend towards replacing animal tests with non-invasive human studies where possible, like the old forced swim test in rodents for depression research. Now, increasingly, you see researchers using things like MMRI brain scans on consenting human volunteers instead. You're studying the same biology, but reducing animal use and getting human-relevant data directly.
So it's less suffering and maybe even better science in some cases.
Potentially, yes. It reflects this growing commitment to minimizing harm across the board.
So it's not about valuing one over the other, but recognizing different capacities and applying the right ethical standards.
Yeah.
And in both areas, things like pre-registering studies and independent oversight are becoming more common.
Exactly right. Pre-registration, independent welfare monitoring, it all points towards embedding ethical practice deeply into the research process itself, whether it's with humans or animals. Rigor and ethics go hand in hand.
Okay, now let's get into something potentially heavier. The power that comes with knowing how humans tick. The moral implications here seem pretty significant.
They really are. This is where it gets, well, complicated and sometimes worrying. Understanding motivation, influence, prediction, that's powerful knowledge. Cambridge Analytica is the big, stark example everyone thinks of.
Right? The Facebook data scandal?
Yeah, harvesting data from, what, up to 87 million profiles? Using psychographic models to micro-target voters in the 2016 U.S. election. The way it was described, like weapons-grade communications, tells you something about the perceived power.
It sounds like a double-edged sword, though. That same kind of predictive insight could be used for good, right? Like tailoring health messages.
Absolutely. You could use similar analytics to, say, design more effective vaccine campaigns for specific communities. Huge potential benefit. But then you see the potential misuse, maybe even destabilizing democratic processes. It's the same underlying knowledge.
And algorithms add another layer, don't they? Like the COMPAS tool used in U.S. courts.
Right, the recidivism score. It's meant to predict the likelihood someone might reoffend to help inform judges. But the research, particularly from ProPublica, suggested serious issues.
Bias.
Potential bias, yeah. Findings indicated it might overpredict reoffending risk for Black defendants compared to white defendants and underpredict for white defendants. So a tool intended to be objective.
Could actually end up entrenching injustice.
Wow. It really highlights that the technical ability, the code itself, isn't enough. You need this deep commitment to fairness, to examining potential impacts. That's why you now see many journals requiring an ethics and societal impact statement from researchers.
Ah, that makes sense. Forces people to think about the downstream effects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this leads nicely into another tricky area our sources raise. Judging past research by today's standards. How do we handle that?
It's tough. You absolutely have to consider the context, the norms of the time. You can't just impose today's views wholesale onto the past, but...
We can't ignore harm either.
Exactly. Ignoring the harm erases the victims. The Tuskegee syphilis study is just such a painful, crucial example.
Running from the 30s to the 70s.
For decades, yes. Deliberately withholding penicillin, a known cure by then, from hundreds of Black men with syphilis just to study the disease's progression. It's horrifying.
And it was eventually condemned.
Strongly. A federal panel in 1972 called it ethically unjustified. There was eventually government compensation, an apology, but the damage done was immense, not just physically, but to trust.
And there are other examples, like the sugar industry influencing nutrition science.
Right, back in the 60s, paying researchers to downplay sugar's role in heart disease and point the finger more at fat, it skewed dietary advice for decades.
So looking back, even with context, helps us see what needed to change.
Absolutely. Re-examining these cases has directly led to safeguards we have now. Mandatory conflict of interest disclosures, data transparency requirements, community review boards for research involving vulnerable populations. We learn, hopefully, from these terrible mistakes.
Okay, let's talk about what even gets studied in the first place. Our sources suggest that certain values shape which questions are seen as legitimate or worth funding.
That's a really sharp point. What gets researched isn't purely driven by scientific curiosity. Funding structures, cultural norms, political agendas, they all play a huge role.
Can you give an example?
Well, the sources mention health economics research on opioid prescribing patterns. Funding for that really surged, but only after the overdose crisis hit crisis levels in wealthier nations. Addiction in poorer regions, often still understudied, underfunded.
So the urgency or visibility in certain places drives the focus.
It often seems that way. Think about the massive budgets for market research, trying to figure out how to sell us stuff, versus the often smaller budgets for research on, say, alleviating poverty. Commercial value versus social urgency, it's not always balanced.
Which seems like a problem if we want science to address the biggest human challenges.
It is. And that asymmetry is partly why you see things like participatory action research models emerging.
Where the community gets involved.
Exactly. Communities co-design the research, identify the questions that matter to them. Maybe it's the mental health impacts of forced migration or access to clean water issues that might get overlooked by traditional funding routes. It tries to rebalance that power dynamic a bit.
Making research more relevant and maybe more just. Okay, last big topic before we wrap up. This tension between just describing things versus prescribing solutions. Should human scientists stick to just the facts, Or should they recommend actions?
The classic description versus prescription debate. It's a tricky one. The argument for pure description is about maintaining objectivity, right? Let scientists find the facts, let policymakers decide what to do.
That was reasonable.
But as our sources point out, that kind of neutrality isn't always neutral in its effect. Take social media algorithms. If research shows they amplify self-harm content.
Just describing that feels incomplete.
Some would argue yes. They'd say researchers, having identified the harm, have some responsibility to suggest ways to fix it, to mitigate that harm.
And there's a similar debate around dark patterns online, those sneaky website designs.
Exactly. Behavioral economists document how these online checkout tricks manipulate users into buying things they didn't intend to. Is it enough to just expose the trick? Or should researchers also advocate for policies to ban them?
So what's the way forward?
Well, a pragmatic approach our sources touch on is role clarity. Researchers present their data, their causal findings, transparently. Then, if they offer policy recommendations, they clearly label them as informed opinions, separate from the core scientific findings.
Distinguishing fact from recommendation.
Precisely. And we're also seeing more multi-stakeholder panels bringing scientists, ethicists, the public together to help bridge that gap between evidence and action in a responsible way.
That sounds like a sensible path. So wrapping this all up, the big takeaway really seems to be that ethics isn't some checkbox exercise in the human sciences.
Not at all. It's absolutely fundamental. It's a core design principle, influencing everything from the questions asked to the methods used to how findings impact society.
We've seen the hard lessons from Milgram, Tuskegee, the sugar industry, and the new challenges with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, biased algorithms.
Yeah, and all these examples, past and present, just underscore the constant need for ethical vigilance. It has to be grounded in those core principles.
Autonomy, doing good, fairness, transparency.
Exactly. Those principles are what allow the human sciences to actually advance understanding while still respecting human dignity. That's the goal.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe mull over. In this world that's increasingly driven by data, where we know more and more about behavior, what's our individual responsibility, yours and mine, in making sure that knowledge is used ethically?
That's a big question. Definitely something to think about.